Ethan Caldwell shoved the marriage certificate across the table so hard it skidded off the edge and hit the floor. "Pick it up," he said, voice flat as a blade. "Sign it, then go to the back room and stay there." The woman, who had just stepped off a 6-day stagecoach ride, looked down at the paper on the floor. Then she looked up at him. She did not move to pick it up. "Mr. Caldwell," Josie Harper said quietly, "your ranch is 11 months from foreclosure. I've seen your ledger. So before we talk about where I sleep, let's talk about whether you'll have a roof left to sleep under. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to my channel and tap that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter had taken Ethan Caldwell 3 evenings to write, and he'd thrown the first 2 drafts into the stove. He wasn't a man who asked for things. He'd built the Caldwell Ranch from 40 acres of rocky Montana soil with his own 2 hands and 38 years of stubbornness, and for most of his life, that had been enough. But 4 winters of eating alone had ground something down in him that he couldn't name and refused to examine, and the ranch needed things he didn't know how to provide anymore. So he wrote the letter. He kept it plain. He kept it controlled, seeking a wife for practical purposes. Must be quiet, modest, capable of household work. No complications, no expectations beyond what is agreed upon. Respond to Ethan Caldwell, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. He mailed it on a Tuesday and told himself he felt nothing either way. That was 6 weeks ago. Now he stood at the edge of the Harlan Creek station with his hat pulled low and his jaw tight, watching the stagecoach slow to a stop in a cloud of pale summer dust. He'd come alone deliberately. He didn't want an audience for this. What he got instead was half of Bitterroot Valley finding reasons to be at the station that particular morning. Mrs. Polimas from the dry goods store, Tom Greer from the livery, both Hatch brothers leaning against the post office wall with their arms crossed and their eyes already hunting for entertainment. Word traveled fast in a town this small. He hated every one of them for being there. The stage door opened. The driver dropped a carpet bag onto the platform without ceremony. Then a hand appeared on the doorframe. Then a woman stepped down, and every conversation within 20 feet stopped at exactly the same moment. She was not what he'd asked for, not even close. She stood straight as a rifle barrel and looked around the station with dark measuring eyes, took in the crowd, the mountains, the dust, and Ethan himself in the space of about 4 seconds. No nervousness, no searching for a friendly face. Her traveling dress was plain, but perfectly kept her dark hair pinned back without fuss. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to say a word to make a room rearrange itself. Ethan felt something cold and unwelcome move through his chest. Behind him, Tom Greer let out a low whistle. Mrs. Polimas leaned to her companion and said something he didn't catch and didn't need to. The woman walked toward him, direct, unhurried. She stopped 2 feet away and extended her hand like she was closing a business deal she'd already decided to win. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Josie Harper." He shook her hand because his mother had raised him with manners even when he'd discarded most everything else she'd tried to give him. Her grip was firm and dry. "You're not what I described," he said. She tilted her head slightly, not offended, not apologetic. "The agency guarantees character references and transport, Mr. Caldwell, not appearance." She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper. 3 letters of recommendation. "Read them whenever you like." She held it out and waited. He took it without looking at it. "I was specific in my letter. You described what you believed you needed," she said, and her voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned long ago not to waste urgency. There's usually a difference between that and what's actually required. One of the Hatch brothers laughed out loud. Ethan did not turn around. "Wagon's there," he said. He picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it, not because he felt generous, but because he wasn't going to give the town the satisfaction of watching him make a woman carry her own luggage and walk to the wagon without looking back. Her footsteps followed on the wooden platform. Steady, unhurried, matching his pace without effort. They drove out of town in silence. He kept his eyes on the trail. The mountains sat enormous and indifferent against the July sky the way they always did, and he tried to use that the way he usually could, to make every human problem feel smaller and more manageable by comparison. It wasn't working. "You can ask," she said. 10 minutes out of town, no preamble. I don't have questions. Your jaw says otherwise. He glanced sideways at her. She was watching the trail ahead, hands folded in her lap, entirely settled into herself. "Where are you from?" he said. Not warmly. Just because it was the least revealing thing he wanted to know. "Missouri. St. Louis for the last 6 years." A pause. "I was a bookkeeper for a shipping firm. Before you construct a story about why I'm here, I left on my own terms. The owner's son decided my job description included things I hadn't agreed to. When I made my disagreement clear, the position became untenable." She said this without heat, without performance, like reporting weather. "I am not running from anything legal or shameful. I am simply choosing my next situation rather than having one forced on me." Ethan said nothing. "You read my ledger," he said after a moment. "It was in the outer pocket of the file box the driver loaded with your mail. Nothing sealed. That ledger wasn't meant for passengers." "No," she agreed. "But it was accessible, and it told me more about what I was arriving into than your letter did." He gripped the reins tighter. "And what did it tell you? That you've deferred maintenance on your north fence line for at least 2 seasons. That your mortgage balance can't be covered at current cattle prices. And that a man named Roy Decker has a water boundary note in your files that is written less like a business agreement and more like the first page of a lawsuit." She turned and looked at him directly. "You didn't order a quiet wife because you wanted peace, Mr. Caldwell. You ordered one because you've stopped believing anyone can actually help you." The wagon rolled over a rut, and neither of them moved. "I ordered a wife," he said, "not a diagnosis." "You can have a wife," she said, "but I won't pretend to be something I'm not to make you comfortable while your ranch collapses around you. That doesn't serve either of us." He pulled the horses to a stop. Not a planned stop. His hands just went still, and the horses slowed and halted in the middle of the open trail with nothing around them but grass and sky and the distant sound of the creek. He turned and looked at her. She looked back, not challenging him, not afraid of him. Just there, fully, completely present in a way that no one had been in that wagon seat in 4 years. "You've got nerve," he said. "I've needed it," she said simply. He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he clicked the horses forward, and they drove the rest of the way to the ranch without another word. The ranch house sat at the end of a long, rutted drive, flanked by a barn in better shape than the house, and a tool shed that leaned slightly east. The garden along the south wall had gone to weeds. The porch had a loose board he'd been stepping around so long he'd stopped registering it. Josie registered it immediately. He watched her clock it as she stepped up and then step around it without a word. Inside, he showed her the backroom clean spare window facing east for morning light. He'd put fresh linen on the bed the night before, which had cost him 20 minutes standing in a closet, trying to remember how his mother used to fold the corners. He wasn't going to mention that. "It suits me," she said. "No lock on the door," he said. It seemed like something that needed saying. She looked at him with an expression that was neither gratitude nor challenge. "I'm not concerned." He ate supper alone at the main table, while she organized her things, and when she came out and sat across from him and picked up her spoon without ceremony, the silence in the room was different from his usual silence. His regular silence was empty. This one felt inhabited. "The Decker note," she said, midway through the meal. "It's not a legal claim. It's structured like one that intends to become one." She set her spoon down and looked at him. "I've seen documents like that in shipping disputes. They're written to be cited later to establish that the other party had prior knowledge and didn't formally object. If he presents it at a proceeding, and you haven't countered it in writing it, becomes part of the record by default." Ethan was quiet. "Roy Decker's been working that creek boundary for 8 years, he said finally. "Every few years he finds a new angle. What's the angle now?" Man named Carver. Claims to be a survey assistant. Says he has documentation from the original territorial mapping that puts the boundary line different than what my father recorded. Josie stilled. He could see her thinking, not anxious thinking, not worried thinking. The kind that moved through information the way water moves through rock. Patient. Looking for the crack. Original survey records are filed with the Territorial Land Office, she said. Yes. Do you have copies of your father's survey documentation? In the barn. Haven't touched that box in years. She stood up from the table and picked up her lantern. Then let's touch it now, she said. He didn't argue. He got his own lantern and followed her out. They found the box in the back corner of the barn under an old horse blanket and a broken bridle. She pulled it out herself and set it on the workbench with the efficiency of someone who had sorted files in dim light before. He held the lantern while she worked. Survey notes from 1861. Hand-drawn boundary maps with his father's pencil annotations in the margins. A copy of the original territorial deed, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. This, she said quietly, and held up the survey map toward the light. What about it? These fixed benchmark points. She turned the map so he could see. Every boundary line is calculated from these. They're permanent, territorial. They don't move. Her finger traced one of the lines. If Carver is claiming the boundary was originally recorded differently, his numbers have to account for these markers. You cannot adjust one line without throwing off every surrounding measurement. She looked up at him. The lantern light moved across her face, and she didn't look away. If someone altered that record, the mathematics will expose it. The numbers have to balance. When they don't, someone made an error. They cannot walk back. Ethan looked at the map, looked at her. You knew to look for that, he said. I've seen falsified shipping manifests, she said. Land surveys work on the same principle. The only difference is the scale. She folded the map with careful precision. Do you know anyone who worked the original survey crew or the Territorial Land Office from that period? He was quiet for a moment. Walter Briggs, retired Land Office examiner, lives out in the Eastern Valley. Can you reach him? I can ride out. Do it tomorrow, she said. Decker has been building toward whatever he's planning for months at minimum. We need to know what the real survey record shows before he presents his version of it publicly. She said without noticing she'd said it. He noticed. He stood in his own barn in the July darkness with a woman he'd known for less than a day, watching her stack his father's old survey documents in a neat ordered pile, and felt something in the architecture of his chest shift in a way he hadn't been prepared for and didn't have language to address. He'd spent 4 years building walls precise enough to keep everything out. He'd been thorough about it, methodical. It hadn't occurred to him that someone might walk through the door already knowing where the load-bearing ones were. It's late, he said, because he needed to say something that wasn't what he was actually thinking. It is. She picked up her lantern. I'll organize these properly tomorrow morning. You should have them indexed before you ride to Briggs. He'll want to know what you're working from. She walked toward the barn door and then stopped without turning around. Mr. Caldwell? What? I know this isn't what you asked for. Her voice was level, not apologetic, not aggressive, just honest the way a person is honest when they've run out of reasons to be anything else. I know I'm not what you planned, but I don't intend to leave, and I don't intend to be a problem. What I intend is to be useful. A pause. You can decide what to do with that. She walked out into the dark toward the house. He stood in the barn for a long time after her lantern disappeared. The horses breathed slow and steady around him. Outside, the Montana night pressed in from every direction, enormous and quiet the way it always had. He'd ordered someone to fill a house. He had not ordered someone who made him feel standing in his own barn at the end of a long, hard day that the house had been empty for reasons he hadn't fully admitted to himself. He blew out the lantern. Tomorrow he would ride to Walter Briggs. Tomorrow he would start fighting back against Roy Decker. Tomorrow there would be practical things to do, problems with edges he could work against, and he was good at that. He had always been good at that. But tonight, walking back across the dark yard toward a house with a light still burning in the east-facing window, Ethan Caldwell felt the first uneasy crack of something he had not felt in 4 years. The specific, unwelcome, undeniable sensation of not being entirely alone. And somewhere beneath the wariness, beneath the walls, beneath 4 years of careful and deliberate solitude, he didn't entirely hate it. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. He rode out to Walter Briggs before sunrise. He didn't tell Josie he was leaving early. He simply rose in the dark, saddled the gray, and went, because that was how he'd done everything for 4 years alone, and without announcement, and old habits didn't break overnight just because a woman from Missouri had walked into his barn and rearranged his thinking. But when he came through the kitchen on his way to the door, there was already coffee on the stove and a folded piece of paper on the table with his name on it. He opened it. Inside, in clean, precise handwriting, were 3 questions. What year does your father's survey deed record the original boundary measurement? Does the Carver document Decker referenced give a specific date of correction? And what was Walter Briggs's exact role at the land office? Examiner recorder or field surveyor? At the bottom, she'd written, "The answers matter. Come back with all 3. Ethan stood in the dark kitchen holding that piece of paper and felt something move through him that was uncomfortably close to gratitude. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket and walked out without letting himself think about it too carefully. Walter Briggs lived 40 minutes east on a property that had seen better decades. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had once been large and had slowly compressed with age, and he met Ethan at the door with a rifle in one hand and a coffee cup in the other before Ethan had finished tying off the horse. "Caldwell," he said, squinting. "Early for a social call." "Not a social call, Walter." Briggs looked at him for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." Inside, Ethan laid out the situation in plain terms. Decker Carver, the claimed boundary adjustment, the county survey review in less than 2 weeks. Briggs listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Ethan had always respected about the old man. He let information arrive completely before he touched it. When Ethan finished, Briggs set down his coffee cup. "Carver," he said. "What's his first name?" "Don't know. Decker just called him Carver. There was a Carver worked as a survey assistant in this territory in the late 60s. Abel Carver, young man barely trained." Briggs's eyes went distant for a moment. "Unreliable. I flagged 2 of his field measurements for error in 1869 before he was let go." Ethan went very still. "Let go when?" "Summer of 1869, maybe early autumn." Briggs looked at him directly. "Why?" "Because Decker is claiming Carver's documentation corrects an error from the original survey. I need to know what date that document carries." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You bring your father's deed." Ethan pulled the folded survey map from his coat, the one Josie had set on top of the organized pile the night before, and spread it on Briggs's table. The old man bent over it, ran one finger along the benchmark points without touching the paper, read the annotation dates in the margins. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did a kind of sharpening, like a man who's been half asleep and just heard something that woke him completely. "These benchmarks," Briggs said, "your father recorded them against the 1861 territorial standards. Those don't move, Caldwell. They're fixed against geological markers. If anyone claims a boundary adjustment after 1861 that contradicts these coordinates, the adjustment creates a measurable angular deviation." He straightened up and looked at Ethan hard. "An impossible one. The land doesn't bend because a man writes a different number." "How impossible?" 11 degrees minimum based on what I'm seeing here. In land survey terms, that's not a correction. That's a fabrication." Ethan drove back to the ranch with that word sitting in his chest like a coal. Fabrication. Not a dispute. Not a competing interpretation. A fabrication. He found Josie in the front room with every document from the barn box spread across the table in organized rows, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, and a ledger page filled with her own handwritten notes beside it. She looked up when he came through the door and read his face before he said a single word. "You found something," she said. Walter Briggs confirmed the benchmark deviation. If Carver's document contradicts those coordinates, the math doesn't hold. He pulled out his own notes from the ride. And Briggs knew Carver, Abel Carver. Let go from the survey office in the summer or early autumn of 1869 for unreliable fieldwork. Josie set down her pen. She picked it back up immediately and wrote something. Then she looked up. "What date does Decker claim the Carver document was written?" "I don't know. I haven't seen it." "We need to know," she said, "because if that document is dated after Carver was dismissed, it was written by a man who no longer had official standing. And if it's dated before his dismissal," she paused, "then we need his employment record from the land office to confirm whether he was actually present in this county at the time." Ethan looked at her across the table, covered in his father's old papers and his ranch's failing numbers and 4 years of accumulated damage. And he said, "How do you know to think like this?" She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, just considering how much to give. "I watched a man in St. Louis destroy another man's business with a falsified shipping invoice," she said at last. "He did it slowly, carefully, one document at a time. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the paper trail looked real, and the damage was done." She looked at him steadily. "Decker is doing the same thing. He's not using force, he's using paper. Which means the only way to stop him is to make his paper fall apart." The room was very quiet. "The county review is 11 days out," Ethan said. "Then we have 11 days. She turned back to her notes. "Ride into town tomorrow. Talk to the county clerk. Find out if Decker has formally submitted the Carver document yet, and if so, get the date it carries. Don't ask for a copy, just the date. A clerk can tell you that without it becoming an event. And if he's already submitted it, then we request the land office employment record for Abel Carver," she said, "which is a public territorial document. Anyone can request it." She looked at him. "Decker will know we're looking once we request it, so we do it last. We build what we have first, then we pull that record in front of the officials at the review and let it speak for itself." Ethan sat down at the table for the first time. He looked at the documents laid out in front of him, his father's handwriting, his father's careful measurements, the records of a man who had built something real on honest ground, and felt a heaviness move through him that had nothing to do with the legal threat and everything to do with time. All the years he'd spent managing this ranch in isolation, holding it together by sheer stubbornness while it slowly bled at the edges. All the mornings he'd sat at this table alone and told himself that was the only way. "I should have dealt with Decker years ago," he said. Not to her specifically, just out loud. "Yes," she said, which surprised him. Most people would have offered comfort. She offered truth. "But you're dealing with him now, that's what matters." He looked at her. She was already back to her notes. "Josie?" She looked up. "The questions you left this morning," he said. "How did you know what to ask?" She considered that. "Because I spent the night going through your father's documents, and I knew what information was missing," she said. "You had the map. You didn't have the timeline. Every falsified document has a timeline problem. That's always where it breaks." He nodded slowly. Briggs said he could come to the review. Something moved across her face, not quite relief, but the absence of a tension she'd been carrying quietly. "Good," she said. "That's good." That evening, Roy Decker's foreman, a man named Holt, rode up the drive just before dark. Ethan met him at the fence. Holt was younger than Decker by 20 years and meaner in the particular way of men who had learned that meanness was a useful tool. "Mr. Decker wants you to know the document's been submitted to the county," Holt said. "Official record now. Thought you'd want to know before the review so you don't embarrass yourself showing up unprepared. Tell Decker I appreciate his consideration," Ethan said, voice flat. Holt's eyes moved past him to the porch. Josie was standing there again. She had a quality of appearing at significant moments that Ethan was beginning to think was not entirely accidental. Didn't expect Caldwell to get himself a woman, Holt said. His tone had something in it that Ethan didn't like at all. Expect it, Ethan said. His voice dropped a register without him deciding to lower it. And ride back and tell Decker the same thing I've told him for 8 years. That creek boundary is where it's always been. Holt looked at him for a moment with a smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Ethan didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he turned and walked to the porch. Josie watched him come. "The document's been submitted," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes?" "Date?" Holt didn't say, but now we know it's in the record. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Decker sent him to rattle me." "Did it work?" He looked up at her. "No." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "It will get worse before the review. He'll come at you from another direction. People like Decker don't use one document, they use the document plus something else. Something personal. Something designed to make you look unstable or dishonest in front of the officials before the evidence even comes out. Something like what? What? I don't know yet," she said. "But I'd rather expect it and be wrong than be surprised." She paused. "Is there anything in your past that he could use? A debt, a dispute, anything that ended badly?" Ethan was quiet for a moment longer than she expected. "Margaret," he said. Josie waited. He didn't want to say it. He'd built a careful architecture of not saying it over 4 years. But she was asking directly, and he'd learned in the last 36 hours that she processed information better than she processed omission. "My wife," he said. "She left 4 years ago. Went back east with a man from the Territorial Bank. The same bank that holds my mortgage." He said it evenly, the way you say something you've rehearsed into numbness. "There were people in town who said I drove her off, that I was too cold, too closed, that I cared more about the land than the person standing on it." The night was very still. "And was that true?" Josie asked. Not cruel, not soft, just asking. He met her eyes. "Partially," he said. "I was closed. I am closed. But she knew what she was agreeing to, and she agreed to it. And then she decided she'd agreed to something else without telling me she'd changed her mind." He paused. "I don't know how much of it was my fault and how much was hers. I stopped trying to calculate it." Josie was quiet for the moment. Then she said, "Decker could use that. A man who couldn't keep his wife. A man the town already thinks of as cold and difficult. If he can paint you as unreliable before the review, the officials will read the documents through that lens." She looked at him evenly. "Which means you can't go into that review alone." He stood very still. "I'll be there," she said. Quietly, firmly. "As your wife. Not as a woman who arrived 3 days ago on a stagecoach from St. Louis. As the woman who manages your household and has reviewed your land records and stands with you in front of this county as someone who chose you." She held his gaze, and there was nothing flinching in her eyes, nothing performed. "Decker wants to show them a man with nothing behind him. We're going to show them something different." Ethan felt the thing in his chest that had been shifting since the barn last night shift again harder this time, further from where it had started. "You'd do that," he said. "I already am," she said simply. "I signed the same certificate you did." He looked at her for a long time in the last light of the evening, with the Montana sky going dark behind her, and the ranch sitting quiet around them, and 11 days left before everything either held or didn't. Then he said, "There's something I should have said when you arrived." She waited. "You were right," he said. "On the wagon. About why I wrote that letter the way I did." He looked out at the darkening tree line rather than at her face. "I didn't order a quiet woman because I wanted peace. I ordered one because I stopped believing that anyone would stay." He said it the way he'd said everything difficult in his life, fast and flat, because that was the only way it came out without stopping. That was a coward's logic, and I knew it when I wrote it. The porch was very quiet. "I know," Josie said. He looked back at her. "I knew it on the wagon too," she said. "That's why I didn't argue about it. You can't argue someone out of something they haven't admitted to yet." The corner of her mouth moved barely, the closest thing to warmth she'd shown him that hadn't been practical. I just waited. He stood at the bottom of his own porch steps, with the dark coming down hard, and a fight on the horizon that was going to determine whether he kept everything his father had built, and felt the strange and entirely unwelcome and absolutely undeniable sensation of being seen by another person. Not judged, not managed, seen. It was the most unsettling thing that had happened to him in 4 years, and that he thought grimly was saying something considerable. "Get some rest," he said, because he needed the conversation to end before he said something he hadn't organized yet. "You too," she said. She went inside without drama, without a backward look. He stood alone on the dark drive for a while after the door closed. Somewhere out past the fence line, a coyote called once and went quiet. 11 days. A forged document in the county record. A man who had been planning this for 8 months. A town that already doubted him. And in his house, a woman who had arrived like a storm on a clear day and was already holding things together with both hands, the ranch, the case, and something in him that he hadn't realized was still worth holding. He turned and walked inside. Tomorrow, he was going to fight back. He rode into Harlan Creek the next morning with the survey map folded in his coat pocket and Josie's list of questions written on the back of an envelope in his breast pocket. And he made himself ride past the dry goods store and the livery and the 2 men outside the feed merchant who stopped talking when they saw him coming. And he kept his face neutral and his back straight, because that was the only way to enter a hostile room, like you'd already decided the outcome before you arrived. The county clerk's office was a narrow room at the back of the Territorial Administration Building, staffed by a small man named Purvis, who had been recording Bitterroot Valley's official documents for 15 years, and who looked up from his desk with the particular expression of a man who knew exactly why a visitor had come and had already prepared to be unhelpful. "Mr. Caldwell," Purvis said. "Purvis." Ethan stood at the counter. "I need to know the date on the Carver document Decker submitted to the county record." Purvis blinked. "That's a submitted document. It's official record now." "I know it's official record. That's why I'm asking for the date. Official records are public." A pause. Purvis set down his pen with the slowness of a man deciding how much difficulty to create. "The document carries a date of September 14th, 1868. Ethan kept his face still, September 1868. He turned and walked out of the clerk's office without another word, and he didn't let himself react until he was back on his horse and moving down the main street at an even pace. And then he pulled out Josie's envelope and wrote the date on it with the pencil stub in his coat pocket and rode for home at a pace considerably faster than he'd ridden in. September 1868. Briggs had said Carver was dismissed in the summer or early autumn of 1869. If Carver had still been employed in September 1868, the document's date wouldn't help them. They would need the exact employment records to confirm his status. But if, and Ethan felt something cold and electric move through him, if Briggs could confirm that Carver had already been flagged for unreliability before September 1868, or if the land office records showed something else about that period. He pushed the gray faster. Josie was waiting on the porch when he came up the drive. She read his face before he dismounted. "September 1868, he said. She was already thinking. He could see it the way her eyes went focused and still moving through information like fingers through a card file. "Briggs flagged Carver's work before the dismissal," she said. "Do you know when?" He said 1869, but I don't know if there were earlier flags. "We need the complete employment record," she said. "Not just the dismissal date. The full record, every notation, every flag, every supervisor entry." She looked at him directly. If Briggs flagged Carver's work before September 1868, that document was produced by a man whose own supervisors had already documented him as unreliable. That's not just a timeline problem, that's a credibility problem attached to the document before Decker even submits it. Ethan tied off the horse. "Requesting that record tips Decker that we're looking." "We request it today," she said. "Not through the clerk's office here. Through the Territorial Land Office directly by mail. It goes out today and arrives in Helena in 4 days. We get the response back before the review." She paused. "Decker will find out we requested it, but he won't know what we found until it's too late to adjust." He looked at her. "You mapped this out last night." "I mapped several possibilities last night," she said. "This is the one that fits the date." They wrote the records request together at the kitchen table that afternoon, Josie drafting the formal language and Ethan signing it, and the letter went out with the afternoon post rider before the sun hit the western ridge. Then they waited, and waiting was the hardest thing either of them had done in the preceding week, because waiting meant the ranch went quiet, and the quiet meant there was nothing between them and whatever was building in the space they occupied together. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Josie fixed the loose porch board without telling Ethan she was going to do it. He came out one morning, and it was done new wood proper nails, set flush with the rest of the planking. He stood on it and felt it hold, and didn't say anything at breakfast. And then later, when she was out checking the south fence line, he hadn't asked her to check. He went and looked at the board again, and the workmanship was clean and careful. He asked her at supper how she knew how to do that. "My father was a carpenter," she said. "I was the oldest of 4, and there was no son, so I learned what needed to be learned. And bookkeeping. The same reason. Someone had to understand the numbers." She looked at her plate. "He died when I was 19. I kept the business running for 2 years until my youngest brother was old enough to take it over. Then I went to St. Louis because there was nothing left that needed me there." Ethan set down his fork. There was something in the way she said it. Nothing left that needed me there that went into him like a splinter. Not the sadness of it, which was real, but the particular shape of it. A woman who organized herself entirely around necessity. Around being needed. Around being useful to structures that then one by one stopped requiring her. "Is that why you answered the agency letter?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Partially," she said. "I answered it because I wanted a situation I had chosen rather than one I had fallen into, and because the letter was honest even if it was cold." She looked at him. "You didn't pretend to be offering something you weren't." "I wasn't offering much." "No," she said. "But what you offered was real. I've found that's rarer than it sounds." He didn't know what to do with that, so he picked up his fork again and they finished supper in silence. That was by that point an entirely different kind of silence than it had been a week before. On the 4th day, the reply came from Helena. Ethan was in the barn when Josie brought it out. She'd signed for it from the post rider, and she walked straight to the barn with the letter in her hand and her face giving away nothing, which told him she'd already read it. He took it from her. Abel Carver, Survey Assistant 3rd Class, employed by the Territorial Land Office from March 1867 through October 1869. First notation of unreliable fieldwork, April 1868. Second notation, July 1868. Formal warning issued August 12, 1868. Suspended from field assignment, August 19, 1868. Reinstated to clerical duties only September 2, 1868. Ethan looked up from the paper. "September 2nd, he said. 12 days before the date on Decker's document," Josie said. Her voice was even, controlled. But her eyes were alive with something that was very close to fire. On September 14, 1868, Abel Carver was confined to clerical duties only. He had been formally suspended from field assignment. He had no authority to conduct, certify, or record any boundary survey work. Any document he produced with a field notation or a boundary correction on that date was produced outside the scope of his official standing. The barn was absolutely still. "It's not just a mathematical impossibility," Ethan said slowly. "It's an unauthorized document," she said. "Produced by a man who had been stripped of the authority to produce it. Presented to this county as official survey evidence." She paused. Decker either knew that and submitted it anyway, or Carver deceived him. Either way, the document is invalid on its face. Ethan folded the letter and held it in his hand, and felt something move through him that was bigger than relief. His father had measured that boundary in 1861 with honest instruments and honest numbers. Ethan had fought for it for 8 years by instinct and stubbornness. And now a woman who had been in his house for less than 2 weeks had pulled the thread that unraveled the whole thing. "We bring this to Walter Briggs before the review," he said. "Yes. And we bring the original employment record, not a summary. The actual certified copy from Helena. We need Briggs to present the mathematical impossibility, and we present the authorization failure. 2 separate foundations. If Decker challenges one, the other still stands." "You've done this before," Ethan said. It came out before he thought about saying it. She looked at him. "Not land law, but yes, I've built a counter case before." She paused and something moved across her face that she didn't fully suppress. "In St. Louis. Against the man whose son decided I was available. I built a written record dates witnesses' correspondence. I intended to present it formally." She stopped. "What happened?" "He moved me to a different position before I could present it. I left instead." A pause. "I should have stayed and fought." The words sat between them. "You're fighting now," Ethan said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I am." They rode to Walter Briggs together the following morning. Ethan had not planned to ask her to come, but when he came out to saddle the horses, she was already dressed to ride with the Helena letter in her coat pocket. And he didn't say anything, just saddled the second horse without comment. Briggs met them at the door and looked at Josie with the careful assessment of an old man who had spent decades evaluating evidence, and he said, "You're the woman from the stagecoach." "I am," she said. "The town's talking about you." "I expect so," she said. "They're saying you're too sharp for a mail order arrangement." He looked at Ethan. "They're saying Caldwell doesn't know what he's gotten himself into." "The town can say what it likes," Ethan said. Briggs held the door wider. "Come in then. Let's see what you've got." They spread the documents on Briggs's table. The Helena employment record. The original survey map. The date from the Purvis, September 14th, 1868. Briggs read everything in complete silence. He read it twice. He set his glasses on top of the papers and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "The deviation I calculated from your father's benchmarks," he said finally, "is 11.3 degrees. No legitimate correction produces that deviation. None." He picked up the Helena record. "And this man had no field authority on the date this document was allegedly produced." He looked up at them both. "This isn't a disputed boundary. This is a fabricated document submitted to a county record by a man who either committed fraud himself or was knowingly used to commit it." "Can you present that at the review?" Josie asked. "I spent 22 years in that land office," Briggs said. "I'll not only present it, I'll testify to the methodology under oath if they ask." He looked at Ethan. "You've had the evidence to beat this for decades, son. It was sitting in that box in your barn." "I know," Ethan said. "What you didn't have was someone who knew how to read it." Ethan didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Briggs was looking at Josie when he said it. The ride back from Briggs was quiet in the comfortable way that the best kinds of quiet are not empty, not tense, but full of things that didn't need saying yet. The mountains were doing what mountains do, sitting enormous and permanent in every direction, and Ethan let himself feel the solidity of the ground under the horse's feet, and the weight of the documents in his coat, and the presence of the woman riding alongside him, who had arrived 10 days ago as an inconvenience and had become without announcement or ceremony the most essential person on his property. He was 2 miles from home when the second rider appeared on the trail. Not Decker's foreman this time. A younger man he didn't recognize, pushing his horse harder than the road warranted, and when the man pulled up alongside them and looked at Ethan, his expression had the uncomfortable quality of someone delivering information they'd been paid to deliver and weren't proud of the transaction. "You Caldwell?" "I am." "Message from Mr. Decker." The man held out a folded paper. "Said to make sure you got it today." Ethan took it. The rider turned and went back the way he'd come without waiting. He unfolded the paper. It was short. 3 sentences. His eyes moved across them, and he felt the bottom drop out of the ground he'd just spent 10 days building. Josie said nothing. She waited. He handed her the paper. She read it. He watched her face go very still. The note read, "Mr. Caldwell, I expect you've been building your case. I've been building mine. I wonder if your new wife knows that the mortgage on your property was co-signed by my bank in 1871 and that the co-signer, your father's business partner, a Mr. Thomas Greer, assigned his interest to my holding company in 1878. I own a portion of your debt, Caldwell. If you pursue the survey challenge, I will call the outstanding balance in full. 30 days. Yours, R. Decker." Josie lowered the paper. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "He owns part of the mortgage," Ethan said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "I didn't know. I never—" He stopped. "Greer. Tom Greer. He was my father's partner in the early years. He sold his share of the operation in '76, I thought, entirely." "He sold his operational share," Josie said quietly, "but not his financial interest." She folded the paper with the same precision she folded everything and held it against her knee. Decker didn't just build a fraudulent survey case. He built a financial trap underneath it. She looked at him. "He's been planning this for longer than 8 months." The trail was very still around them. "If he calls that balance," Ethan said, "I can't meet it in 30 days. The cattle aren't sold, the harvest isn't in. I'd lose the ranch not in the survey room, but in a bank office." "Yes," she said. She wasn't going to soften it. "So even if we beat him at the review, he has a second lever," she said. "And he's just shown it to us." Ethan stared at the trail ahead. He'd fought Roy Decker for 8 years with stubbornness and endurance, and the kind of grim refusal to yield that had kept everything intact through sheer force of will. And in one folded note delivered by a paid writer, Decker had shown him that none of that had ever been the point. The point was the debt. The point had always been the debt. "What do we do?" he said. It was the first time he'd said "we" to her. He heard it as it came out of him and didn't pull it back. She heard it too. He could tell by the slight shift in her posture, something settling, something deciding. "We don't panic," she said. "That's the first thing. He sent this note today because the review is in 6 days and he wants you to walk into that room already broken. If you panic, he wins before the first document is read." "And the second thing?" She was quiet for a moment. That felt like it had its own weight. "My father's business partner," she said slowly, "assigned a financial interest without the primary party's knowledge. That assignment may or may not have been properly recorded. If Decker's claim to that interest has any procedural flaw in its documentation—" She looked at him. "He's built this entire scheme on paper, which means every piece of that paper can be examined. Every transfer, every assignment, every notation." Ethan looked at her. "You want to look at the mortgage documents," he said. "I want to look at every document that connects Decker to your debt," she said. "Tonight. All of them." A pause. "Because a man who fabricates survey records to steal land might not be any more careful about the legal quality of his financial transactions." The ranch came into view at the end of the drive. Ethan rode toward it with the weight of Decker's note in his pocket and the survey map in his coat and 6 days on the clock and something in him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, because hope felt presumptuous, but something close to it. Something that moved like purpose through all the cold and careful distance he'd built around himself. She was right beside him. She had been right beside him since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach and refused to pick up the certificate he'd shoved on the floor. And whatever came next, whatever Decker had buried in the financial records, whatever the review would bring, whatever it cost, he understood clearly in that moment on the drive home that he was not going to face it the way he'd faced everything else for 4 years. He was not going to face it alone. The mortgage documents were in a tin box under the floorboard in Ethan's bedroom, a place he hadn't opened in 3 years, because there were things a man put away when he stopped believing they mattered. He pulled the box out and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and Josie was already seated with her notes and a fresh candle and the Helena employment record laid flat beside her, and he understood without either of them saying it that they were going to be at this table for a very long time. She went through the documents the way she went through everything methodically, without hurry, without the kind of anxious speed that made people miss things. The original mortgage from 1871. The co-signature from Thomas Greer. The operational partnership dissolution from 1876. She read each document fully before setting it down and moving to the next. Ethan sat across from her and watched her read, and didn't speak, because he'd learned quickly that interrupting her while she was thinking was like stepping on a clockwork mechanism mid-turn. It didn't stop the process, it just damaged it. 20 minutes passed. She picked up the partnership dissolution document and read it a second time. Then she set it down and looked at him. Thomas Greer dissolved his operational partnership in 1876, she said. This document is properly executed and witnessed. She paused. But it references the financial interest only obliquely. It says, and I'm reading exactly, all operational claims and associated interests hereby relinquished to Ethan Caldwell in full. That's what I remembered, Ethan said. Associated interests. I took that to mean everything. It might mean everything, she said, or it might mean only the interests associated with the operational partnership, not the mortgage co-signature, which was a separate financial instrument executed separately in 1871. She tapped the document. Decker is claiming Greer assigned his mortgage interest to Decker's holding company in 1878. But if Greer had already relinquished associated interests in 1876, she stopped. Then he had nothing left to assign in 1878. Ethan said, possibly. It depends on how a territorial court interprets associated interests. It's not clean language. She sat back. But here's what is clean. If Decker's holding company received an assignment from Greer in 1878, that assignment document exists somewhere. It had to be recorded to be enforceable. She looked at him. Has any bank or holding company ever formally notified you in writing that they held an interest in your mortgage? Ethan went very still. He thought about it. Went back through 4 years, 8 years further. No, he said slowly. No formal notice. I've dealt with the territorial bank directly since my father died. Always. No other party ever contacted me. Josie's eyes sharpened. In most territorial recording standards, a transferred financial interest has to be disclosed to the primary debtor to be legally exercised. If Decker's company acquired Greer's interest in 1878 and never notified you, they may hold the paper, but they cannot exercise it without first establishing proper notice. She leaned forward. Which means his threat to call the balance in 30 days may not be legally executable. Not without a court first establishing that the transfer was properly recorded and properly disclosed. Ethan stared at her. He's bluffing, he said. Not entirely. The interest may be real, but the ability to act on it immediately to call the balance in 30 days without prior formal notice to you, that's where his ground gets soft. She paused. He sent that note to frighten you into withdrawing from the survey review. If you show up at that review with the survey evidence intact, he loses the boundary claim. The mortgage threat was meant to make you surrender before that happens. The candle threw long shadows across the table and the documents, and the two of them sitting across from each other in the deep quiet of a Montana night with 6 days left on the clock. We need a lawyer, Ethan said. Yes. There's no one in Bitterroot I'd trust with this. Not with Decker having connections through the territorial bank. Helena, she said. Is there anyone in Helena? He thought for a moment. My father used a man named Aldous Crane, property law. I haven't spoken to him in 15 years. Write to him tonight, she said. Tell him what you have: the mortgage document, the 1876 dissolution, the lack of formal transfer notice. Ask him specifically whether a transferred mortgage interest can be exercised without prior written disclosure to the primary debtor under current territorial law. She slid a piece of paper across the table and set the pen beside it. Tonight, Ethan. Not tomorrow. He picked up the pen. He wrote the letter at that table with Josie reading the mortgage documents a third time beside him, and when he finished, she read what he'd written without asking permission, and made 2 corrections, a legal terminology issue and a date he'd remembered wrong, and he didn't argue either correction because she was right both times. The letter went out with the first light rider at dawn. 4 days to the review. The town turned against Josie on the third day before the review, which should have surprised no one, but landed like a slap regardless. It started in the dry goods store. Ethan heard about it from the feed merchant's boy, who told him with the breathless honesty of a 12-year-old that Mrs. Polimas had been saying things. That the woman Caldwell had ordered off the agency wasn't who she claimed to be. That she'd left St. Louis under a shadow. That there had been a situation with a married man in Missouri. Ethan stood in the feed merchant's doorway and felt a cold fury settle into his bones. He rode home and told Josie directly because she had earned directness. She listened without flinching. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. He counted without meaning to, and then she said, "Decker." "Yes. He couldn't shake you on the survey. He couldn't shake you on the mortgage threat, so he's going after me." She said it without self-pity, just the flat recognition of a tactical move. "If the town discredits me before the review, anything I've contributed to your case looks suspect. Walter Briggs is still solid, but if the officials have heard that your wife is a woman of questionable character—" She stopped. "He's trying to contaminate the context. What do you want to do about it?" She looked at him steadily. "What I want and what's strategic may be two different things. Tell me both." A pause. "What I want is to walk into that dry goods store and say my piece to Mrs. Polimas directly." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that had edges. "What's strategic is to let it go show up at the review composed and present, and let the documents speak instead of me." "And if I don't want to let it go," Ethan said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "It's not your fight to pick," she said carefully. "You're my wife," he said. "In this county in front of these people, you are my wife. That makes it my fight whether you want it to be or not." The kitchen was very quiet. "You'd go to Polimas," she said. "Not a question. I'd go to wherever Decker's gossip is coming from, and I'd make clear that my wife's character is not up for public discussion." He said it evenly. "That's not anger talking. That's just how it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't fully contain, something that had nothing to do with strategy or documents or legal terminology. Something that was simply human and unguarded, and gone again before he could examine it closely. "Don't make enemies you don't need," she said finally. "Not this week. Polimas isn't an enemy. She's a gossip. There's a difference." He picked up his hat. "I'll be back before dark." He went into town, and he didn't raise his voice once. He walked into the dry goods store, and he looked at Mrs. Polimas across the counter with the same expression he used on unruly cattle and difficult weather, and he said in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear, "Whatever you've been told about my wife is Decker's business dressed up as concern. I'd think carefully about whose water you're carrying before you carry any more of it, ma'am." Mrs. Polimas turned the color of old chalk. He bought a pound of coffee, thanked her with complete courtesy, and left. By the time he got home, Josie had the response from Aldous Crane in Helena spread on the table. The lawyer had replied by return rider, which meant he'd turned it around in under 36 hours, which meant it was urgent enough that he'd moved everything else. Ethan read it standing at the table. Crane's language was precise and unambiguous under current territorial property law. A transferred mortgage interest acquired by a third party from an original co-signer was unenforceable against the primary debtor without formal written notice delivered to and acknowledged by that debtor prior to any attempted exercise of that interest. Furthermore, the 1876 dissolution document's language, all operational claims and associated interests, was in Crane's professional reading broad enough to encompass the 1871 mortgage co-signature making the 1878 assignment from Greer to Decker's holding company, potentially void ab initio. He was prepared to argue both positions and would travel to Bitterroot for the survey review if Ethan required his presence. Ethan set the letter down. "He's saying the mortgage threat is hollow," he said. He's saying it's legally contestable on two separate grounds, Josie corrected, which in practical terms means Decker cannot walk into a court and call that balance without a significant legal fight that he is not guaranteed to win. She paused, which is not the same as the threat disappearing, but it means he has no clean 30-day hammer. He'd have to litigate first, which takes months, long past the survey review. Long past the survey review? She agreed. Ethan exhaled. It was a long, controlled exhale, the kind a man makes when he's been holding something in his chest for 4 days and finally has permission to let it go. "Wire Crane," he said. "Tell him to come." The night before the review, Decker made his final move. It came not through a rider this time, and not through gossip in the dry goods store. It came through the door of the ranch house itself in the form of a woman Ethan had not seen in 4 years. Margaret Caldwell. Margaret Hale, now he'd heard, though he'd made a point of not keeping track, came up the drive in a hired buggy at 7:30 in the evening, with her chin level and her hands in her lap, and the particular expression of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and had decided she was righteous in saying it. Ethan heard the buggy wheels on the drive and went to the door, and his entire body went the specific cold that only one kind of history produces. Josie appeared at his shoulder without him hearing her move. She saw his face. She looked out at the buggy and said nothing. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she said simply, and stepped onto the porch beside him. Margaret climbed down from the buggy and looked at Ethan, and then looked at Josie, and her expression did something complicated. "Ethan," she said. "Margaret?" He kept his voice entirely flat. "This isn't a good time. Roy thought it might help if I talked to you," she said. "Before tomorrow." The cold in Ethan's chest turned to something harder. "Roy," he said. Roy has been a friend to me since—" She stopped, started again. "He said you're being unreasonable about the boundary, and that there are people getting hurt on both sides, and that if you just sit down and—" "He sent you," Ethan said. "Decker sent you here." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "He didn't send me. I came because I thought—" "He sent you," Ethan said again, and his voice was so quiet and so certain that she stopped. "Because the survey evidence didn't work, and the mortgage threat didn't work, and the gossip about my wife didn't work. So he sent the one person he calculated would put me off my feet before tomorrow morning." He looked at her without anger, something that had cost him 4 years to arrive at, and which he recognized in this moment was genuine. "I'm not angry at you, Margaret, but I need you to understand that whatever Roy Decker told you about this boundary dispute, he left out the part where his survey document is a fabrication. He left out the part where his mortgage claim is legally void. He left out the part where he's been planning this for longer than either of us has known him." Margaret stared at him. Something moved in her face. Doubt, real doubt, the kind that doesn't perform itself. "That's not—" She stopped. "I know you didn't know," he said. "That's the only reason I'm saying this to you instead of just sending you back. Go home, Margaret. Don't let Decker use you again." She stood in the drive for a long moment. Then she looked at Josie. Really looked at her, the way women look at each other when they're past pretense, and Josie met her eyes without hostility or triumph, just with the level, steady presence that was simply who she was. Margaret got back in the buggy. She didn't say anything else. She turned the buggy and went back down the drive, and the sound of the wheels faded into the Montana dark, and the ranch was quiet again. Ethan stood on the porch with his hands at his sides. Josie didn't say anything for a while. She let the quiet breathe. Then she said, "You've been carrying that for 4 years." "Yes." "And you're not carrying it anymore." He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about anything. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." She nodded, just once, the way she acknowledged things that didn't need elaboration. They went back inside, and she made coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with the survey documents and the Helena letter and the employment record from the Territorial Land Office all organized in front of him, and he thought about his father measuring that boundary in 1861 with honest instruments on honest ground, and he thought about what tomorrow was going to require. "Josie," he said. She looked at him from the stove. "What you said the other night," he said, "about standing beside me at the review, as my wife." "I meant it," she said. "I know you did." He paused. He was not a man who said things easily, and the things that mattered most to him were the hardest of all to put into language that fit. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I am not going to forget what you've done here. Not the documents, and not the legal work, and not the Briggs ride." He looked at his hands on the table. "What I'm not going to forget is that you stayed. When it got hard and complicated and ugly, you didn't pull back. You moved forward." The kitchen was very still. "That's who I am," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "That's the point." She set the coffee down in front of him, and her hand rested on the table for just a moment, not reaching for him, not performing warmth, just present. The way she was always present. Complete and without apology. Then she sat down across from him and picked up the employment record and read it one more time, because tomorrow was coming, and there was still work to do, and neither of them was the kind of person who left work unfinished. The candle burned down between them. Outside, the Montana night pressed in, enormous and quiet and indifferent, the way it always had, the way it always would. But inside the ranch house, something had changed permanently in the structure of things. Something that had nothing to do with survey maps, or mortgage documents, or county reviews, and everything to do with two people sitting at a table together in the dark, preparing to fight for something that had become, without either of them quite deciding it worth fighting for. Tomorrow, Roy Decker would find out what that was worth. They left for the county seat before dawn. Ethan had the survey documents in a leather satchel across his shoulder, and the Helena letter in his breast pocket, and Walter Briggs met them at the junction road at first light, riding a horse that was older than most of the arguments they were about to make, and considerably more reliable. Aldous Crane had arrived by stage the previous evening, and was already at the county building. When they got there, a thin, precise man in his 60s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been in more difficult rooms than this one, and had walked out of all of them. Crane shook Ethan's hand, and then looked at Josie and said, "You're the one who found the employment record." "I requested it," she said. "Same thing," he said, and there was something in his tone that was the closest a territorial lawyer of his generation got to admiration. "It's the strongest piece we have." The county review room filled quickly. Half of Bitterroot had come not because they'd been invited, but because word had reached every corner of the valley, and people understood the way people in small places always understand that what happened in that room today was going to determine something beyond one ranch's boundary line. It was going to determine what kind of place Bitterroot Valley was going to be. Roy Decker arrived with two men flanking him and his lawyer. A younger man named Fitch, who had the aggressive posture of someone billing by the hour and intending to earn it. Decker looked at Ethan across the room with the calculating expression of a man who has played the final hand and believes he knows every card on the table. He looked at Josie for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. That second told Ethan everything about how worried Decker actually was. The county surveyor, a man named Alderman, called the proceeding to order. He was a methodical man, gray-haired with the patient authority of someone who had refereed land disputes for 20 years and had no interest in drama, only in accuracy. He laid out the process simply. The disputed boundary would be examined. Both parties would present supporting documentation, and the official survey record would be cross-referenced against both sets of evidence before any determination was made. Fitch moved immediately. "The Decker party requests the Carver document be entered into evidence first," he said, "as it represents the most recent professional survey notation and establishes the basis for the boundary correction being claimed." Alderman nodded. "Granted. Present the document." Fitch placed the Carver document on the examination table with the confidence of a man laying down an ace. Crane didn't move. He sat with his hands folded on his own document case and let Fitch have his moment entirely, and Ethan had enough experience with difficult men to recognize that kind of patience as its own form of aggression. Alderman examined the Carver document. Read it top to bottom. Noted the date. Set it down. The document is entered, he said. Caldwell party your response. Crane stood. He placed the territorial employment record from Helena on the table beside the Carver document, and he said in a voice that carried without effort to every corner of the room, "We'd ask the surveyor to note the date on the Carver document. September 14th, 1868. Alderman looked at the date. Noted. We'd then ask the surveyor to read the entry for September 2nd, 1868, in the certified employment record of one Abel Carver, issued by the Territorial Land Office in Helena." Crane paused. Specifically, the notation regarding his field assignment status. Alderman picked up the Helena record, found the entry, read it. The room was absolutely silent. He set the record down. This record indicates that on September 2nd, 1868, Abel Carver was suspended from field assignment and restricted to clerical duties only. Crane said, which means that on September 14th, 1868, the date the Carver document claims to record a field boundary correction. Abel Carver had no authority to conduct, certify, or record any field survey work. He had been formally stripped of that authority 12 days prior. Crane looked at Alderman directly. The document Decker submitted as evidence of a legitimate boundary correction was produced by a man who had no standing to produce it. The room broke into noise. Decker's lawyer was on his feet. "The suspension is an internal personnel matter. It doesn't invalidate the technical findings in the document itself." "The technical findings in the document are invalid on their own terms," Crane said, and he didn't raise his voice, which made him heard more clearly than Fitch's volume. "Which brings us to the second matter." He looked at Briggs and gave a single nod. Walter Briggs rose from his chair in the front row and walked to the examination table with the deliberate movement of a man who had spent 22 years making sure that his every step in official proceedings was beyond question. He placed his own document on the table, his written analysis 3 pages prepared the night before in the lamplight of his Eastern Valley property. "I served as land office examiner in this territory for 22 years, Briggs said to Alderman. "I personally flagged Abel Carver's fieldwork for error on 2 separate occasions prior to his suspension. I am prepared to testify under oath to that fact." He opened his analysis to the survey map. The boundary adjustment claimed in the Carver document produces an angular deviation of 11.3 degrees from the fixed territorial benchmarks recorded in the 1861 survey. "I have calculated this deviation 3 times using independent methods. The number does not change." He looked at Alderman steadily. "An 11-degree deviation from established benchmarks is not a correction. It is a geometric impossibility in legitimate land measurement. No valid survey adjustment of the Caldwell boundary could produce this result. None," Fitch said sharply. "The Decker party contests the methodology." "Contest it with a counter-calculation," Crane said pleasantly. "We'll wait." Fitch did not produce a counter-calculation because there was no counter-calculation to produce. The math was what it was. The math had always been what it was. Decker sat very still at the far table. For the first time since Ethan had known him across 8 years of disputes and cold evaluations, Roy Decker looked like a man who was sitting inside a structure that was coming down around him and had not yet decided how to get out. Alderman studied the Briggs analysis. He studied the Carver document. He studied the 1861 survey map with Ethan's father's careful annotations. He took his time, and the room held its collective breath while he did. Then he set everything down and said, "I am going to take a 30-minute recess to review the full record. Both parties will remain available." He left the room. Ethan sat at the table with Crane on his left and Josie on his right and didn't speak. He could feel Josie's stillness beside him. She had a quality of being completely motionless under pressure, like water that runs deepest where it makes the least noise. And he had come to rely on that stillness the way he relied on the fence lines holding and the creek running clear. Crane leaned close and said quietly, "The recess is a formality. He's seen the deviation calculation. He's seen the employment record. He knows." "Then why the recess?" Ethan said. "Because he's giving Decker time to consider withdrawing voluntarily." Crane said. A surveyor who rules against a submitted document in a formal review is making an official finding of potential fraud. That carries consequences. Alderman is a careful man. He's giving Decker a door. Josie said very quietly. Decker won't take it. Crane looked at her. Why not? Because men like Decker don't believe they've lost until the building is already on the ground, she said. He'll push it to the ruling. She was right. Decker's lawyer spent the recess at his client's table talking in a low, urgent voice, and Decker sat listening with his arms crossed and his jaw set. And when Alderman came back into the room 30 minutes later, Fitch rose immediately and said the Decker party maintained its position in full. Alderman sat down. He opened the record book and picked up his pen, and the room went so quiet that Ethan could hear the scratch of the nib before the words came. Having reviewed the totality of the submitted evidence, Alderman said, This office finds as follows. The document submitted by the Decker party dated September 14, 1868, and attributed to Abel Carver, survey assistant, is hereby determined to be without official standing. The preparer lacked the field authority required to produce a valid boundary notation on the date in question as established by the certified territorial employment record entered into evidence. Furthermore, the angular deviation identified by examiner Walter Briggs renders the document's technical claims irreconcilable with established territorial benchmarks. The original boundary, as recorded in the 1861 Caldwell survey deed, stands as the legally recognized boundary of the Caldwell property. The creek boundary is confirmed as recorded. He set the pen down. The Decker claim is denied in full. The room came apart at the seams. People were standing. Voices overlapped. Somewhere behind Ethan, someone said something that sounded like approval, and somewhere to his left, someone said something that sounded like shock, and none of it penetrated the particular quality of silence that had settled inside his chest. His father's numbers had held. His father had measured that boundary honestly in 1861, and the land had remembered it, and the math had kept it, and no amount of careful, patient, paper-built fraud had been able to move it. Crane was shaking his hand. Briggs was on his feet with an expression of professional satisfaction on his weathered face. Ethan shook hands with both of them and thanked them both and meant it completely. Then he turned to Josie. She was sitting very still in her chair. Not performing composure, she was simply composed the way she had been from the first moment she'd stepped off that stagecoach and looked around the station and seen everything clearly. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were steady. He sat down beside her. It held, he said. It was always going to hold, she said. The truth of your father's survey was always there. It just needed someone to look at it properly. You looked at it, he said. We looked at it, she said. The same way she'd said we on the trail back from Briggs 3 days ago, without noticing, without performance, like it had simply become the natural word. He didn't say anything else right then, because right then, Decker was crossing the room toward them, and the room noticed and went quiet again, the way rooms do when they sense that a significant thing is about to be said or not said. Decker stopped 2 feet from the table. He looked at Ethan. His face had the particular quality of a man who has lost something he believed was inevitable and has not yet restructured his understanding of the world to accommodate the loss. This isn't finished, Decker said. It is, Ethan said. Alderman's ruling is official record. The mortgage interest is legally unenforceable without prior formal notice to the primary debtor, Crane said from Ethan's left pleasantly and without looking up from his document case, which was never provided. My client would be pleased to litigate that question if you'd like to pursue it. We feel confident in our position. Decker looked at Crane, then at Ethan, then for a long moment at Josie. Josie looked back at him with the same level, unhurried steadiness she'd aimed at everything else, not triumphant, not angry, just present and clear-eyed and entirely unmoved. Decker turned and walked out of the room. His lawyer followed. The 2 men who'd flanked him at the start followed after that. And the door closed behind them, and the room exhaled, and the thing that Roy Decker had been building for 8 years, the careful, patient document-by-document architecture of a theft, walked out with him, and was gone. Briggs clasped Ethan's shoulder on the way out and said, "Your father was a good man, and he built well. Both things." He looked at Josie. "Ma'am." He touched his hat and left. Crane collected his documents and told Ethan he would follow up in writing regarding the mortgage interest and the recommended steps to formalize Decker's failure of proper notice in the official record. And then he too was gone, and the room emptied around them, and Ethan and Josie walked out of the county building into the Montana morning with the whole valley lying open in every direction and nowhere particular that they needed to be in the next 10 minutes. They stood outside on the steps for a moment. "Tom Greer saw the whole thing," Josie said. Ethan looked. Tom Greer, who'd been at the station the day Josie arrived, and who'd been carrying Decker's water in the valley for months, was standing across the street with his hat in his hands looking at the ground. He glanced up and met Ethan's eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away. "He'll talk," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "He will, because that's what he does. But this time, what he says will be different." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You're not bothered?" "Not today," she said simply. They rode home. The ranch was exactly as they'd left it that morning, the barn in better shape than the house, the tool shed leaning slightly east, the new wood on the porch board Josie had replaced. The garden along the south wall was still mostly weeds, but she'd cleared a section near the foundation 2 days ago, and the soil underneath was dark and willing. He unsaddled the horses, and she went into the house, and when he came in, she was standing at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the window, and he could see that the composure she'd held all day was settling into something quieter and more private. "You all right?" he asked. She turned. "Yes," she said, and then, after a moment, "I thought about what I said to you that first night, in the barn, that I intended to be useful." She paused. "I want you to know that was true then, but it isn't all that's true now." He set the satchel on the table. "What else is true?" he said. She looked at him with the directness that had been hers from the first moment, but with something underneath it, now that was less armored, less the composure of a woman who had learned to need nothing, and more the openness of one who had decided carefully and deliberately to need something after all. "I think you know," she said. "I'd rather hear you say it," he said. "I've been a man who leaves things unsaid for too long." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was still around them, the afternoon light coming through the east window, the ranch sitting solid and secured outside. "I came here to choose something instead of falling into it," she said. "I chose correctly." She held his gaze. "I am not here because I have nowhere else to be, Ethan. I am here because this is where I want to be. This land, this work." A pause, the kind that carries the most weight. "You." The word sat in the room like something that had been waiting to be said since the wagon road outside of Harlan Creek Station, since the barn and the lantern, and the survey map since coffee before dawn, and letters to Helena, and a porch board fixed without being asked. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, the way a man handles something he has decided he is not going to lose, and he said, "I ordered a quiet wife." "I know," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I got the wrong woman entirely." "Yes," she said. "You did." "Best thing that ever happened to this ranch," he said. "The ranch," she said, raising an eyebrow. "And the man on it," he said. The stubborn closed 4 years alone man who didn't know what he needed until it stepped off a stagecoach and told him his ledger was a catastrophe. She laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the first full one he'd heard from her, and it changed her face entirely, and he made a private decision in that moment that he was going to spend a considerable amount of effort earning more of them. He kissed her the way he'd wanted to since the barn, and hadn't admitted to wanting, not carefully, not with reservation, but with the full weight of a man who has stopped pretending that restraint is the same thing as strength. She kissed him back exactly the same way. Outside the Caldwell Ranch sat in the afternoon light with its secured fence lines and its honest boundary, and the creek running clean along the edge of the property, where it had always run, where the law had just confirmed it would always run. The garden waited with its willing soil. The barn held its horses steady. The porch board held firm under every step. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd shoved the marriage certificate on the first night, the same table where she'd left him 3 questions before dawn. The same table where they'd spread his father's documents, and his mother's folded linens, and the letters from Helena, and the truth about a debt and a fraud, and a 4-year silence, and they ate supper together, without formality or performance, and the conversation moved the way conversation moves between people who have stopped being careful with each other. He told her about his father building the south fence line in the winter of 1863 with 2 feet of snow and no help. She told him about her father teaching her to read a level on a carpenter's frame when she was 7 years old, because he said a person who couldn't tell if something was straight had no business building anything. He was right, Ethan said. He usually was, she said. I try not to hold it against him. After supper, he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He sat on the porch in the evening dark, not because there was something that needed attending to, but simply because the evening was there and the land was quiet, and he had someone to sit with. Josie came out and sat beside him, and they didn't talk for a while, just let the Montana dark come down around the ranch, and the stars come up over the mountains, and the creek sound carry faint from the property line. Tomorrow, she said after a while. I want to start on the north fence line. That's a 2-week job, he said. I know, she said. I was going to do it in stages. A pause. Unless you have something more pressing. No, he said. Nothing more pressing. She nodded. He looked out at the land his father had measured honestly and his mother had tended carefully, and which he had held by stubbornness alone for 4 years, waiting without knowing he was waiting for something he couldn't name. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. Not dramatically, not with declaration, just the simple, certain gesture of a man who has decided. She let him. Her hand was steady in his the way everything about her was steady. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The ranch held them both in the dark, solid and certain and real. And Ethan Caldwell sat on his porch with the woman he had not ordered and had not expected, and could not now imagine living without, and understood at last, fully without reservation, without the careful distance he'd mistaken for self-sufficiency, that the life he'd been enduring for 4 years was over, and the life he'd been meant to live had been waiting at the end of a 6-day stagecoach ride all along. Some things cannot be ordered. They cannot be planned or specified or written in plain language on a piece of paper mailed to St. Louis on a Tuesday. They arrive on their own terms at their own time, with a firm handshake and a straight spine and 3 letters of recommendation and the absolute unshakable intention to stay. And in Bitterroot Valley, Montana, on the ranch where the creek ran honest and the boundary held true, Ethan Caldwell and Josie Harper had found exactly that. Not the arrangement either of them had planned, but the life both of them had earned, chosen, freely held tightly, and built to last.